right, now we're going to talk some endgames. This is the second portion of the course. And obviously you played a number of memorable endgames over the years. You're known as an exceptional endgame player. So we've chosen some particularly instructive ones. We're going to start out with a game you played in 2007 in the Bundesliga, the German league, against Grandmaster Zbigniew Gracek. And you were white.
Yeah, I guess I was very slightly better for most of the game. We got to this Rook Ending, which, to be fair, should have been a fairly straightforward draw had he gone h5 at this point. The point is, in case I capture, he takes on b2, rook e7, there's rook b6, and that pawn cannot be won, and basically with 4 against 3, it's even though he has an isolated pawn, it's always going to be a fairly straightforward draw. After he goes king g6, I go g4, which is very important to give those pawns a bit more mobility, which will come in handy as we see later. Now he can still make a draw, I think, but it's not that easy, and it's not really the point of what we're trying to show here. What we're trying to show is that by doing nothing, as he did in the game, it's not as easy as it may look to defend, and we want to demonstrate one of my favorite plans in the game. So here we go. I just pushed the pawn. I guess I just realized that once I start working the king over to the queen side, he's just gonna have way too much counterplay on the king side. So
and that's if you leave your pawn on b6?
Yeah. So whatever winning tries there may be, they sort of have to be connected with b7. And b7 really speaks to me in that you're trying to win without allowing any counterplay whatsoever. Sometimes it's the right strategy, sometimes it's the wrong strategy, but it's one that sort of speaks to my style of chess, and this was really the first time that I was able to implement it in a practical game. So Black has got a number of ways to lose immediately here. If king d6, there is going to be rook d8, rook king c7, and then rook f8, and at least 2 of his pawns will fall in exchange for the b pawn. King e7 looks natural, loses though very instructively to f4, ef, and then e5.
Great idea to know for all of you out there.
Yeah, e6 is coming next, opening up the 7th rank, after which I will skewer his rook. And if he goes king d7, this is a fairly straightforward win in the pawn ending, as I have a passed pawn and he does not. Yeah, we should just note that in case he goes king c5 here.
Tricky.
Yeah, tricky. I guess king f4 wins. Oh, it doesn't, huh?
King d5, g5?
Well, I mean, g5 or g3 doesn't actually matter. g5 is going to go h5.
And then g3?
Yeah, so isn't this a draw though? No,
you're gonna...
Okay, no, it's not. You just go e6 because My point was king e4, king c5.
Mm-hmm. You can give up the e-pawn.
But I can give up the e-pawn, for instance, here.
Take opposition.
King d5. King e8. King d6.
Yes.
Sure. Whenever you capture, there's king d5. So that does actually win. And besides, king e7 is pointless. It doesn't actually threaten anything. So basically he has no counterplay. Whenever he would go king g5, I just go g3. And he doesn't get anywhere. He tries h5 at any point then to create some counterplay. For instance, let's say king f1. King f1, king g5, g3. If he goes h5, I take, and however way he takes, there will be a check on g8 or h8.
And can you briefly explain for the viewers why pushing the pawn to b7 is such a fundamental and critical decision in these types of positions?
So the very basic thing is, whenever you push the pawn to the 7th rank with the rook in front of it, you cannot queen that pawn merely by supporting it with the king, because the king will have no shelter from checks. So let's say white king was on c7 or c6, there will just be rook checks wherever you go.
And your own rook is stuck.
My own rook is stuck. So there's simply no way of queening that pawn in that particular way. The advantage, though, of pushing the pawn to the 7th rank is that it's only one step from promotion, which means that the opponent's rook constantly has to watch it, and you constantly have to watch out for either a rook check, in this case, to e8, or a skewer on the 7th rank.
Mm-hmm.
So the advantage of the move is that it severely limits the active possibilities of the opponent.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of the advantages and disadvantages of that particular move. As I talked about earlier, what speaks to me about it is the restriction part, the fact that you cannot create counterplay once that move has been played.
And it seems to me the decision to play that type of move in these positions almost always boils down to where the opponent's king is, or your ability to create a second pass pawn.
That is very much true. As a lot of you may know, let's say all the black pawns were gone. The black king was on g7 or h7. White had 2 g pawns left. It still will be a draw.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If you have an f pawn, it's a win, because you will raise it forward, force the black king to take it at some point, and you will have that aforementioned skewer. H pawn is also a draw. So yeah, as you said, it does depend on these specific factors. Sometimes, as we will see in a later example, when your opponent has an isolated pawn, pushing the pawn to the 7th can be very, very effective, because the rook will not be able to defend that pawn. So, okay. Anyway, he played king f6, which is, as we could see, it is forced. King d7, there was rook f8. King d6, there was rook d8, followed by rook f8, and after king e7, which is a pointless move, that was f4. And so at this point, I did play g3. Apparently it makes some sense to save that move for later, which didn't actually occur to me.
Right.
At the time, I just had this very clear plan in mind of playing g3, forcing g5, advancing the king off the board, and then we'll see what happens.
Yeah, we have some analysis here showing king f1 as well, but I think one of the main things about these positions is that the play is the way in which you get to your ideal position doesn't matter so much.
Yeah, so it may or may not have been more precise, but I don't know. I'm not really about going into the very fine details here. It's more about showing the main points. So
yeah.
So g5 is forced. I think it's quite instructive to show what would happen after king g7. Let's say f4. F6. If you go ef, gf, e5 will happen, followed by f5. There will be a second pass pawn, and you will win it quite easily.
Yeah. It's one of those pass pawns you want here.
Yeah, and let's say black goes f6. The win is actually pretty simple. Let me, just for the sake of absolute clarity, let's just go g5 first. Black has to go hg, otherwise pass pawn will be created immediately. Fe, and just to fix all the pawns
in your preferred style.
Yeah. Basically, black is absolutely helpless here. We will just advance the king, which cannot be prevented in any way. King d5 will happen, and now you see the point. e5 is going to fall if rook b5, you give up a crucial tempo. King c6 comes, and then you can move the rook away when the pawn will inevitably promote. In other cases, we will simply capture the pawn, move the king away, and queen this pawn instead. So, as I already mentioned, isolated pawns, they're simply usually gonna fall when there's a pawn on the seventh, because of that very motive of the king.
And it looks like a lot of moves, but again, the moves themselves don't matter so much. And no counterplay.
No counterplay. That's the main idea with this whole thing.
Yeah.
Just in these cases, make sure that you don't blunder anything. Like if rook b4, make sure you go king f2.
Yep.
Not king e2, rook e4, which is easy to blunder because you get fixated on the idea that the rook cannot move away from the b file. But then again, a check always takes precedence there. So. Anyway, we will follow what happened in the game. g5 is absolutely forced and correct. I start to go, and what happens now is that apparently here he could put up resistance by putting the king on e7 at some point. I'll just play through the key line here. All of these moves are forced, and now if black doesn't go king d6, I will just move the king forward as I did in the game. And here, apparently, black has counterplay.
2 pawns down.
Yeah. Then again, that's a pretty amazing escape.
Yeah.
But as you could see, my opponent, he had played pretty passively the whole way, and he believed in the defensibility of just playing passively, which I can very much understand. When you see this position, you see pawn is going nowhere, and white is not going to be able to create a pass pawn anytime soon, so we need some magic.
Yeah.
Fortunately, sometimes magic does exist.
And he was a fortress believer, and it cost him.
Yeah, for sure. So he gave a check, and apparently now he is lost, but it's by no means obvious quite yet. So I'm marching the king forward. You can play any number of moves on the previous moves. They don't matter. The same thing is going to happen, regardless, which makes these positions sort of easy to evaluate. Like, you're going to get to a certain position, and it's all about evaluating that one.
Yeah.
So king goes to e8. What happens now is that, let's say he would wait, I would go king f8. He waits again. I go rook a8, rook d8, c8, whatever. Let's say c8, and in case he captures the pawn, there's rook c6 and checkmate.
Beautiful.
So he will have to, after king f8, he will have to go king g6 to prevent that particular checkmate idea, after which I will go king e7 and we will transpose to the game. So he goes king g7 immediately. King e7, rook b2, king d6. And now it's another key point. You could think that f6 might be the most logical move here. The problem now is that we have another theme, which is the transposition to the pawn ending. And now we got the opposition. The only chance for black is to try and create counterplay. We've outflanked our opponent now. Take it, and g4, the simplest way, always like fixing the pawns if possible. King g7, king g3, takes on f6, takes on f3, and king f5.
Yeah.
As
nice.
I'm sure a lot of you know, but it's always very pleasing to make this move.
Yeah.
Wherever the king goes, you capture one of the pawns.
Another great pattern.
Yeah.
And in that line, if white trades rooks on d7, does black draw with king h7?
That's a very good question.
These are the sort of considerations you guys have to take into mind.
So this is what is known as the distant opposition. If I'm not getting,
That's right.
That's the distant opposition. The problem here is that king d6 is a move. And the distant opposition cannot be kept because h6 is occupied by a pawn. So let's say you remove the g3 and the h6 pawns from the board, it will be a draw. But with those on the board, black is in absolute zugzwang, and we will transpose to the line that we had. So I suspect this means that even Rook c8 would probably win the game. And in this case, we actually do have the opposition. And once again, the attempts at counterplay, they're not going to work.
Yeah.
It's just
transposition.
Yeah, it's the transposition.
Oh, does he play king h6 here?
Ooh.
We got our position.
Yeah. Okay. You got me there. So let's go king d7 instead.
Okay. So after the trade, play king e7.
Sorry?
h5.
No, but now we can just go g.
Yes. Okay.
g4, king here, and now either king e8 or king d6 to try and be even more instructive. Actually, king d6 is stupid, right? King h7 preserves, which means that you have to outflank your opponent anyway. So king e8, king g7, king e7, or king g6, king f8.
And if king g6 instead of king h6 at that point? After g4?
Yeah, then we go king e6. Or king e8, same thing.
Right, okay. More outflanking.
Yeah. Yeah, I like this stuff. I think you like it as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Simple.
Love these endgames.
Simple, but very instructive, and it's easy to get lost in.
It's cool to see how far-reaching a move like b7 is, like the variety of endgames possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so king f6, and now comes the key point, which I'd seen from afar, and really excited me. Keep in mind this was a team match. I don't think this particular game mattered for the match. I think we'd won the match already with Baden-Baden, but my teammates were looking at the game and wondering what on earth I was doing. Svidler, for instance, told me during the game that even after I made my next move, he didn't see the idea at first, and he wondered, like, am I trying to lose? Because it didn't make any sense whatsoever. So what happens now is that this would be a draw, except for the fact that we, as mentioned before, we have mating ideas. And now comes the time for the breakthrough with f4. Take, and rook d8. Yeah, that was it was pretty amazing. It's really what I was aiming for when I went for b7. And everything sort of falls into place. If you move the pawn to a7 instead of b7, the black rook would be too far away from the king, because a key point here is that that rook b6 can be met by king c7, obviously, and if the rook was on a6, he would probably be the one who would win instead. So
yeah, it's amazing how this is just a double attack.
Yeah,
main threat and promotion.
And also, if he starts giving checks, the problem again is that I'm not going to allow him to get back to the b file. I'll just go king d5, king c4, whenever he goes back to b2, I'll simply take. I don't have a passed pawn yet, but I'm simply going to go e6, then e5. This pawn is isolated, and as we looked at before, this means that it's just going to be won by that king going to going to d6.
Yeah, can't even play rook b6 like you said.
No. Yeah, it's always king c7. So that's easy. In the game, though, I still had to calculate a bit. But what pleased me a lot is that I'm able to get this mating idea not once, but actually twice. So rook b6 is forced. King d7, c7. Here, moving the rook away would not help. We'd get basically the same as in the game. So he takes an f3. And it's not obvious that white is winning, to be fair. The f3 pawn is far advanced, and I'm sort of running out of pawns. But what I'd also seen in some time in advance is that there are still mating ideas. And f2, the pawn is unstoppable, doesn't matter, still gonna be checkmate.
That's a nice return to the d6 square.
Yeah. So he has to go king e5, king e7, rook a8. That's a straightforward win. He goes king e6 then, not even gonna allow any counterplay. Just go rook a5 to f5. So he goes king e5, rook e8. Now if he goes king d4, there is rook e7 playing precisely. f2, there's always going to be rook f7. He won't be in time to capture the pawn and support his. f6, there's rook e6. And if f5, trying to be tricky, there's just ef or gf, and then rook d6 to d1.
Okay.
So he goes king f4 instead. King. Now if rook e7, that might be a mistake, because he would go f5, try and be tricky. And whatever way I capture, I would probably just lose, because he would win his pawn. I guess I can still go rook f7 here, but who would want to calculate this? So
yeah.
Maybe that's something a lot simpler. So I go king d5 instead. If f2, there's rook f8. Pawn on f7 is going to be captured. So he tried f6, which, well, a desperate try. Now I go rook f8, and in case of king g5, there is e5. And there's also king e6, so he just resigned.
Very nice. And I like that anecdote you relayed about your teammates being confused about what you were doing, perhaps questioning what... Because I assume b7 is probably the move they would take issue if this whole plan had failed.
For sure. That's... Obviously, to some extent, it's a pattern move.
It's a move, if you play it, you better be right about it.
Yeah. So you push the pawn all the way to the 7th, and then, oh, I cannot actually queen it. Well, that's a pity.
Right. Instant regret.
Yeah. But I feel like surprisingly often it turns out to be correct, and as I mentioned, there are advantages to it. You eliminate risk, and you also it also makes the position so much easier to calculate, because once you get that pawn to the 7th, you got all the time in the world.
Yeah. And have you studied some of the great body of theory, like in Dvoretsky's Endgame manual, for instance? I know he devotes a ton of time to the positions with the pawn on the 6th rank, with various pawn configurations.
Yeah, I've obviously looked at that, but I feel like the The pawn on 7th, that's been largely ignored. And I'm not saying like I came up with this or anything.
Right.
But I think it deserves more attention than it's got.
Yeah, for sure. And to that end, maybe it'd be good to take a look at a couple other positions we have related to the Carlsen plan, putting the pawn on the 7th rank.
Yeah, that's what Peter calls it. This is a game I had against Aronian from the Amber tournament. One of my 7 wins in a row. I started with 0 of 2 against Steven Chuk, then 7 wins in a row before it became a bit tricky again. Basically, I'd actually crushed him with the King's Indian in the first game as black, which is pretty sweet. And then in the second game, I don't know, I somehow didn't play very ambitiously. It's all heading towards a draw. And at this point, I thought, yeah, what the hell? I'm just going to go A7. There are any number of ways black can make a draw here. I think the simplest is just to go G5. Oh, yeah, sorry. Put the king on G7. Mm-hmm. We can go take the D6 pawn with the king. Doesn't matter one bit. You just wait. And with these pawns, you're never going to be able to create a pass pawn. Mm-hmm. Push the E pawn. There's a roadblock. So, and with such limited material, let's say you... okay, let's just make a bunch of moves. Just to show my point here. This is not all precise, but what I wanted to show is that in this particular case, the rook endings are always pretty drawn.
Yep. Yeah. Black's king is always perfect on one of the safe squares at the start of this.
Yeah.
And hard to create a pass pawn for you.
Exactly. So basically, it's a dead draw, but it was a dead draw to start with. Obviously, he has so much counterplay with the pass pawn of his own. So there's no reason to think I would have any winning chances whatsoever.
So you judged if you kept the pawn on A6, he's going to have way too much counterplay anyways.
Yeah, I mean, just there's no reason to believe I'm even better.
Yeah,
so I just pushed the pawn to A7 because, yeah, as I said, why not? Mm-hmm. Then he went rook A2, which gave me the first very slight glimmer of hope in that I can go F4, which means that if I can now win the D6 pawn, I may have some hope. So he goes check, nothing wrong with that. And you could still wait. I cannot go too far with my king because that pawn is gonna be way too dangerous. But he decides to go H5. I go G5. And he makes the natural move H4, which may actually be a serious mistake. The point is now something that we talked about before, that this one is isolated. Mm-hmm. It's not going to be protected by another pawn, which means that in this situation where there's a pawn on the 7th, his rook is very much restricted. There is potential for Zugzwang, and there is potential for this pawn just falling. And so I march back with the king. Basically, if he just waits, I can get the pawn to F6. He should never take on F5. Let's say he goes rook A1. Never ever take on F5. Because that, well, what happened there?
Yeah. Oh, there we go.
There we go.
Internet connection issue for a second.
Never ever take, because going to go F6 and then G6 next, winning the rook. But you can just wait. The king is in a box, but I cannot go too far. After king c2, pawn is suddenly running away, and I cannot stop it.
Yeah.
So we can just wait. It looks unpleasant, but
yeah, I guess rook e8, rook e7. Black can always take the a pawn and then give it check.
exactly. No matter where I try and hide my king. So, well, I guess what I could do is get the king to f4.
And then try to do that plan?
Yeah, and then try to do that plan. Yeah. Because you cannot prevent the king from coming to f4 because he has to leave the third rank.
Yeah. And moving the h pawn will be like the game?
Yeah. Maybe it's not as straightforward as I thought. Anyway, so maybe the culprit here is h5. That this at least makes sure that it's not an easy draw for him.
Yeah.
Okay. So anyway, he pushes the pawn. This is just what I wanted to show. That now it might look like he has a pass pawn. I have a pass pawn, but the fact that his king is hemmed in the way that it is, that is a huge deal. Which means that here I could even exchange those pawns. And have good chances of winning the game. Basically here, I'm not sure if you can actually defend. If he can, it's not obvious how. In the game, I just advance with the king. Should be noted that moves like d5 takes, it simply doesn't work. I just advance the king up the board, and okay, I have to be precise. Let's see.
These mad rook scenarios always tricky.
Yeah.
Just in figuring out where you want the king.
The thing is, if I get to e7, let's say rook e4, this is easy.
Right.
Once I get to the 7th rank, or in this case the 8th rank, then there's not going to be stalemates. I don't think so.
And is it maybe
this is confusing me more than than it was before?
And is it maybe simpler to play e5 instead of taking on d5? Is that possible?
Yeah, I'm not so sure.
I wonder if you can just take f7 and... Oh no, that probably won't work. Okay, never mind. Yeah, we're getting into the weeds.
Actually, it does. I guess.
Sack the rook for 2 pawns.
Yeah, could be.
Yeah, I was thinking.
That was brilliant. So what do you got? You got rook f6, right? Maybe this.
I was thinking rook f8 maybe spoils it. Oh no, but rook f8 e7.
Rook f8 e7, king g8 I just take.
Yeah, pass pawn.
And rook h8 I go king d3. That's too cheap. Maybe this actually works. King g8. No.
White's in the square, okay.
White's in the square, yeah, doesn't work. Okay, so maybe e5, but indeed. Anyway, I just wanted to show what happened in the game. This was obviously a rapid game, but yeah, now the rook is on e8, then I can just go hide.
Yep.
That's what happened here.
Nice.
So that was a completely drawn ending that turned on his head when he probably underestimated.
Yeah, semi-forced instance of pushing the pawn to the 7th rank.
Yeah.
No other way to create any chances.
Okay, and I'll finish up with a very simple example. So this is my game against Anand from the Gashimov Memorial last year. A lot of things happened earlier in the game, but we'll start here. So, as I talked about earlier, key theme is that this pawn is isolated. And this is what means that I can go a7. There were a few things to worry about here. There was h4, fixing these pawns. And what is crucial here is that black should not worry about the d5 pawn, because that pawn cannot be saved. The white king will simply corral it. So you should try and create some counterplay while you can. One of the points of this particular move is to try and prevent g3. Takes king g3 and suddenly d4, and there will not be enough pawns to win. So there are a couple of ways to win. Is that I would say maybe the most instructive way is just to actually go g3 and then fg3. What I will do now is I will take the pawn. So let's say black is just waiting. Nothing else to do. Pawn cannot be protected, as we discussed before. Rook a5, there's king b6. So you continue to wait. Now we push the pawns. Maybe not h4 first. We go e4. You continue to wait. And now we're gonna get a very nice Zugzwang eventually. Let's say Rook a6. We're gonna go King c5, Rook a1, and then let me see. Yeah, h6 cannot be taken obviously because of Rook h8 and King d6. Now we're threatening King e7 when this pawn cannot be defended, so the only try is Rook a5. But now we will simply triangulate King d7. There will be... Actually, we don't even need to triangulate. So what I was thinking is... yeah, we can actually just go king. What I was thinking was this, and then this to get Zugzwang. But basically, King d7 is also Zugzwang, because here obviously King d6 is even easier.
Right.
So King d7, King e7 will happen next, and eventually I'll get that second pass pawn. There is nothing close to a fortress there.
Yeah.
So I think that's pretty instructive.
For sure.
The fact that you can actually play g3 and you can go fg3, which looks so ugly.
Yeah.
You would, with a cursory glance at the position, you would think that white has no winning chances whatsoever, with no passed pawns and this pawn being blocked. Well, in reality, it's an absolutely straightforward way.
Yeah, we're conditioned thinking, this other passed rook pawn is not helpful here, but in fact, because that pawn is isolated,
Yeah,
it will be, and we'll get that e-pawn going as well in the future.
absolutely. So he played rook a2, king f5, f3, rook a1, and g3, and now king is coming. So also rook a2, there's king g1. King is running, no counterplay. D pawn will be won. And I will choose the same plan of playing g4 after I've won the pawn. Just one thing that I gotta make sure that I don't do is don't even think about playing e6. For once you may be able to go check, but there's also just takes king wherever, and this is just a fairly straightforward draw. The only chance white has to win is by going f4, then g4, and then h5 to create a passed f pawn, but that will never be enough. You will always have enough checks with a rook, so that there's too much counterplay.
So the winning plan would be what you were showing in the other line, push g4.
The winning plan would be exactly that. So in this case, you would instead, you might even go e5 actually. You would just go g4 and it's the same thing.
Yep.
h6 and then king d6 or king d7 will be to the side.
Right.
So always be careful, but
yeah, and speaking of Anand, actually, one of his nice endgames he won with this is against Nigel Short. I first learned from it in a book, Amateur to IM, where he was up 2 pawns in this scenario with colors reversed and ended up winning very similar situations. So suffice it to say, these top players understand these positions, and that's why Vishy resigned, I guess, after g3.
Yeah, exactly. He realized that, as we talked about earlier, it's going to take a bunch of moves, but that's not going to change anything. He's just helpless.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for explaining your thought process on these positions, especially with the
Yeah.
Carlsen plan, underestimated perhaps by endgame theory. And for those of you at home looking to improve this sort of thing, definitely fully looking at these sort of endgames and also playing them out, I think, is super helpful against a training partner or an engine. So I would highly recommend that myself.
Yeah, absolutely.